All right. So five, four, three, two, and one. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today, Katie May. Katie, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So, Katie is the owner and executive director of Creative Healing. She's a national speaker and trainer specializing in therapy for teens experiencing depression, self harm, and suicidal thoughts. As one of only 11 Linehan board certified dialectical behavior therapy clinicians in Pennsylvania, she's an expert in this gold standard treatment for life threatening behaviors. Katie's committed to helping teens feel accepted for who they are while teaching them skills to build a life they love. Katie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So, before we get going, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
I am from the Philadelphia area originally, right outside Philadelphia. If you live in Philadelphia, you don't like when people right outside Philadelphia actually say Philadelphia. So I'm being specific. And I've actually
Okay,
grown up here. I've been here my whole life.
awesome. So, I used to live outside of Philadelphia and went to
Okay.
school in Philadelphia. Awesome. So, very
Amazing.
cool.
Where'd you go?
Well, I went to what was at the time Philadelphia College of Art on Broad
Oh,
Street,
yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Center
Okay.
City. So,
Cool.
but I miss Philadelphia. All right, look, um, this is an intense topic. I love this topic. We're talking about teens. How did this start for you? How did you get into this field, in this
Yeah.
specialization?
Well, by accident, but on purpose, if that makes sense. When I was a teenager, I struggled a lot with self-harm, with depression. I had kind of a traumatic upbringing due to my parents' divorce. I was raised by a single father. So all of those experiences of it was really difficult for me to be a teenager. And then when I went to college, I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to be a writer. I've been writing my whole life, so that was my identity as a writer and graduated with a degree, found out that I was pregnant. It was the best surprise of my life, but it was a surprise. And so it kind of changed the course of what made sense for me in my life. And after the birth of my child, I decided that I wanted to go back to school to become a therapist and to give back in a way that made sense to make my life and my struggles to make meaning from them, right? To make it worth it that I went through that experience.
So you went to school, you got a degree in journalism or
Clinical
BA,
counseling. Oh,
clinical
I
counseling.
do. I have a BA in English Lit and a minor in journalism.
Okay, but then you went back when you wanted to be a
Correct.
therapist. Okay. Um, all right. You talked a little bit about your upbringing being traumatic, impacting you. When you talked a little bit about self-harm and so forth, uh,
Mhm.
and to the degree that you feel comfortable talking about this stuff, I just want to put that out there. Were To what degree were you conscious of what you were going through and how that was impacting you and your reaction to it, the behaviors you were exhibiting?
At the time, I mean, I consider myself a pretty insightful person, even as a teenager. Again, I've been writing and reflecting on my life my entire life. I learned about the concept of self-harm from a peer who was doing it, and I just kind of was like, "Huh, that's a thing," and that's kind of intriguing. And didn't give it a second thought at that time because it was just like a new and novel and interesting thing that I had never seen before. And then I had an interaction with my dad that was really tense. And looking back on it now and in my own work in therapy, I'm recognizing that like my response to that interaction was a whole lot of shame.
Mm.
And in that moment, my brain just moved me towards, oh, that's a thing that I saw before. I wonder if, and not consciously, but like in a split second, that's a thing that I'm going to do right now. And in that moment, it's what I did. And what I now teach to other parents is that self harm regulates emotions really quickly. It reduces that emotional intensity quickly. And so when that happened for me, it became a coping strategy that I then continued to use in a setting where I had very little control and a whole lot of challenge and difficulty.
When you went back to school, what was your hope? What was your goal if you had one?
hmm Yeah, when I went back to school, I actually didn't intend to work with teenagers either. That's why I say it was still by accident. I went back to school because I wanted to be an addictions counselor. I went through my own 10 years of using substances, my child's father as well. And it just felt like, well, this is another thing that I've overcome. It was more recent and relevant to me. And I said, I can do this. I can help other people through this. And so I went back to school for that reason. But I, I did an internship in like an intensive outpatient setting for substance use, and I hated it. For
Mm.
me, it felt like every day was focused on helping people not do the thing that they wanted to do. And that just felt not, it felt like something that was not right or aligned for the life that I wanted and the career that I wanted. And so I realized that actually wasn't where I wanted to focus my attention. I wanted to focus it more on that life worth living piece, which Dialectical
Mhm.
Behavior Therapy, DBT, were all about moving someone towards the life they want rather than just continuing to white knuckle it through the life they don't want. And that resonated with me and how I got to where I am. And that's kind of how I ended up where I am now.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So let's talk about that. So how did you move into working with teens? And uh, from what you said, one might imagine what your response would be, but why teens? Why adolescents?
Yeah. Well, I got a job. I mean, that's the short answer
Okay.
is that I was offered a job in a child and adolescent partial program, and I didn't at still was like, wow, I'm so, empathetic. I really struggled as a teen. Can I do this? Am I healed enough to do this work? So there were a lot of questions, but it was the job that was offered to me because I had applied at this hospital, and that was the area where they had an opening. So I took the job because I needed a job. And what I realized was that I really connect well with that teen population. I think I'm probably in some arrested development myself, where like, that I'm good at connecting with teens. I'm good at, helping move them through their struggles. And so it just kind of fell together naturally from that point.
What when you say you're good with connecting with teens, what does that mean? Say more about that. Why? How?
Well, I think that teenagers can sniff out
BS?
disingenuousness, BS, like a mile away, 10
Yeah.
miles away. And I've always been radically genuine with my clients. I am who I am. I'm not a blank slate. I don't make it about me, but I'm also not a blank slate. I'm honest. I answer questions, and I treat them as equal individuals in the conversation. And I think that resonates with them. Teenagers naturally don't have a lot of autonomy in their lives. And so when I can provide that to them and I can see them as who they are, I think that creates a really strong rapport between client and therapist.
Was that something you had to learn, or did it just come naturally for you? Like, is that
That
how
piece came naturally.
it
Yeah,
did?
that's just like I don't know how to not be myself even in a work setting. And so that's just how that happened.
I guess what I wanted to ask was, did you understand the importance of that naturally, like from off the bat, or did you learn that? That I look, in order to connect with these kids,
Yeah.
it's important for me or it's important just to be who you are.
I think it was probably innate, but also then a learned insight over time. Like, this is who I am and this is what I'm doing. But then along the way, recognizing that that was a piece of why it was working.
Right, right. Um, I I didn't have that insight that you had. I naturally, when I got out of graduate school, I was working in a clinic where we were assessing and working with kids who were showing early signs of psychosis. So bunch of adolescents, and I loved it. And in a very opposite way to you, I led with my knowledge and my edge,
Okay.
like I have all this information that I want to share and it's gonna work. And instead of what you're saying, instead of like honoring who I was, and there's a whole reason for that, but I learned the importance of exactly what you're saying is us being who we are as clinicians. I'm not no longer a clinician, but for a lot of people, not everyone, but for a lot of people, it's hard to do
Yeah,
what you're saying is to be anything else than who they are. But it's so friggin' powerful, right? And we connect when we're talking to someone or in the presence of someone who is themselves. It's so inspiring, right? We
I think
feel it.
so. Yeah, I would agree with you. I think as a therapist, there's such a Venn diagram too, though, right? It's like being yourself and being genuine, but also having the knowledge and the confidence to support someone through a process. I don't know, and this is maybe controversial, but I don't think the relationship is enough for someone to see changes in therapy. I think it's important, but I also think that the interventions, the knowledge, the experience that you can bring a client through is equally as important. I'm not someone who says like that's all you need is the
Right, of course.
relationship.
And I'm not intimating that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I do think that is a huge piece. Um, so let's talk a little bit about when you started working with this population. What were what was your experience like? What did you start to do? How did you start to um, interact with kids who were maybe sometimes having really intense traumatic experiences?
Yeah. So I am someone who has to learn everything about the thing that I'm doing. So I remember reading a lot of books, in the setting that I was in. And I think most hospital settings are like this. They had a high demand and they didn't have a lot of time to train me to do what
Yeah.
I was doing. So I was thrown into having this really large caseload and figuring it out along the way. And I do remember leaving work sometimes with those sad stories or traumatic situations that over time as a therapist, you learn to contain, hopefully, and be able to transition out of work and into your day. But I do remember just feeling like I'm in the right place to help these kids get something that they're not needing. And I felt like a big piece of that was also educating their parents on how to do things differently in terms of validating or providing support or creating more structure. And so being able to do that work with the child and also to work with the parent helped me feel like I was able to provide validation, give these clients something they maybe weren't getting somewhere else, but also restructure that home environment so that after 7 to 10 days in a partial hospital program, they weren't just going back into a
Hmm.
home that was exactly the same. So, and seeing that revolving door of hospitalizations that I did see all the time.
So you're talking about a partial hospitalization where people who are going into that obviously are experiencing what often suicidal ideation
Suicidal
or
ideation, school avoidance, sometimes psychosis. We would see some OCD, really a little bit of everything, which was an excellent first job experience for me, but
yeah,
we were seeing it all.
yeah. In terms of working with the parents, what was talk about that? What was your approach? What how was that for you, et cetera? Yeah.
It was interesting and it was scary. I think, yeah, my approach was always joining with them and helping them to learn some new skills. The idea that you're doing the best you can and you can do better, and you and your child want and deserve this, so you can have a stronger connection and a better life together. And that wasn't always received well. There
Hmm.
were reactive parents, wounded parents, parents who wanted to drop their kid off and not be a part of the process. But I would say for the most part, it was really welcome. And this is something that I've learned over time as a clinician. When I worked at the hospital program, I was 28, 29, 30. I had a young child at that time, but I felt really insecure in terms of my ability to give advice to other parents,
Hmm.
and felt like they didn't want that, or that I was going to trigger shame, or that I was overstepping. But what I've learned over time, both as a therapist and as a parent who has had a child in therapy, is like when you are in that place, for the most part, you feel helpless and hopeless, and you want someone to direct you and to make it better. And that's why you're there. And so that was the majority of what I noticed, is that people were really grateful that they were learning something to make it different, because nobody wants their kid to be hospitalized.
Right. One of the things I'll never forget is part of our job at the time was taking these referral calls from parents and teachers and other therapists to see if their kid was right for this program, right? So we'd go through this a list of questions. medications, behavior in school and so forth. But 99% of these kids had experienced some kind of trauma.
Yeah.
So you'd, at the end of this call, you'd have this sheet of these, like, oftentimes really intense behaviors. And then a few days later, the kid would walk into the office. And I'll never forget this, just being blown away by this sheet of paper with these crazy behaviors and this kid, this normal looking kid. And you're like, holy crap, that's the kid who's going through all this. And it
Yeah.
really made me think about just how the humanness, I think, of this process, and how so many
Yeah.
of us don't know what each other is experiencing. And for kids, especially, it can be really hard. What do you feel a lot of therapists who maybe don't work with kids or don't have this experience, what do they not get or understand or maybe even need to know about working with this population?
Oh, so many things. The first thing that always comes up for me is that they're not tiny adults. They're in their own developmental stage. And so it's different than being a child and it's different than being an adult. And then
Okay,
the
so hold on there.
oh, go
What
on.
what does that mean then?
Yeah, so developmentally, they are in a stage where they're gravitating more towards their peers. They're figuring out who they are. It's natural for them to test limits and to push back. And so when therapists that mostly treat adults try and work with clients that are adolescents like they work with adults, it's not going to be as effective. And when therapists treat them like children and use the same interventions as they might use with an 8-year-old, it's
Mm,
not going to be effective. And mostly I think that comes back to this idea of them feeling seen for who they are. They don't want to be a child anymore. They might want to be an adult, but they're not an adult. And so we really do need to see them and ground our treatment in the idea that they're in this developmental stage that's very different than being a child and it's not yet an adult.
all right, this is great. I can you give us an example of what this might look like? How someone walks in, a kid walks in, a kid, teen, adolescent walks into your office. Um, let's get specific about an interaction you might put forth that would appreciate their developmental stage.
Okay. I'll use the example of school avoidance because I think it's concrete and we can look at it from all sides. So, teen comes into therapy, they're not going to school, maybe making it 2 days a week. I'm also seeing the parent come in for this intake session and they're saying, like, well, I've taken their phone away. They're not allowed
Mhm.
to play video games and it's still not working, right?
Right.
So, that right there, I pause
I
and
have a
think, like,
15-year-old kid, so
I have a 16-year-old.
yeah.
Um, and so that right there, that's one place where I pause, say, of course that's not working. We don't even understand why they're not going to school. So it's not like when they're, 8 and you can say no video games for the rest of the day because you hit your sibling. Like it's
Mhm.
different. Not that I would have done that back then, but just as an example, like that kind of response is not honoring that this teen is more complex than that, that there's an underlying reason for this behavior. And so joining with the teen wouldn't be starting with that problem. It would be understanding, seems like you're really struggling right now. Like something, I'd probably drop an F-bomb somewhere in that conversation just as
Mhm.
a way to like sprinkle in that we're on the same page or something like that. Really join them in their moment of like, this is really hard for you. Like, tell me what's going
Mhm.
on. So if we're starting with the parents' problem, which is my teen's not going to school, we're already invalidating the teen's experience because we're then trying to solve a problem that's not their actual problem.
Right. Okay. So, as is often the case with a lot of parents, I mean, not, I mean, me myself, oftentimes being reactive to the behavior, and
Yeah,
right, and not taking those steps to look at why the hell is this happening in the first place. Okay.
exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Love that. All right. So continue.
Okay. So then as we're assessing, and I'm very big on assessment, I don't like to jump in with solving problems before I fully understand them. I'm looking at both sides. In my work, I call this the transactional model, meaning what your child does influences how you respond, but how you respond influences how they respond. And oftentimes this is how we get to levels of escalation that are crisis prone. And so as I'm understanding, well, let's look at what a typical day looks like for you, teenager. You wake up, you're already having that pit in your stomach, you're feeling really down. Maybe there's an image in your head of sitting alone in the lunchroom because nobody's talking to you right now. But on the other side of that, parent is nagging them to get out of bed, ripping the covers off of them, spraying them in the face with a squirt bottle or whatever, other strategies they think are going to be effective, yelling at them, shaming them, or also, not because I don't want to villainize parents, really stressed out because they're about to lose their job because they haven't been able to be on time for weeks because
Mhm.
their kid is struggling. So their
Mhm.
behaviors also come from a place of their own struggle. And so, that's one of these important pieces in looking at working with teenagers is you have to look at both sides of the transaction. You have to see how the parent is responding to them, but also a lot of times understanding why the parent's responding to them like that, because teens don't heal in a vacuum. They're not being raised in a vacuum. They can't make changes in a vacuum. And that's why I think the work with teenagers is so complex. And that's why I think a lot of people don't want to do it. I see mostly is because they say, well, I don't want to work with the parents, right?
Mhm.
But you
Mhm.
can't effectively, for many things, I'm not going to say
Right.
all the time, work with a teenager in these kinds of struggles, self-harm, school avoidance, really high risk or acute situations without also involving the parents and getting them to change their own behaviors.
Yeah, I think you're doing an excellent job of uh, articulating how complex and layered it is.
Yeah,
It's not just enough just to work with the kid who's in front of you. It's this whole
right.
system, which can be obviously is very challenging. Let me just remind everyone, I'm speaking with Katie May. She is the executive director of Creative Healing. Um, let's just take a step to the side here, and I want to ask you about the genesis of creative healing. How did that come about? Why did you decide to start that?
Yeah, so going back to the partial hospital program, I had gotten licensed. I knew that my goal was eventually to be in my own private practice. I'm not great at having a boss. And so moving into my own business made sense. And what I found, because part of my job there was to make referrals to outside services, a lot of the teens that were in that program would say, I wish there was a group like at the hospital, but that I could go to after school. And so I
Mhm.
heard that consistently and decided, well, that's how I'm going to start my practice. I'm going to start a teen group and I'm going to
Mm.
help teens stay connected and not have to be in the hospital to get that level of validation and connection. And that's what I did. I started with 1 day a week, which then went to 2 days a week, 3 days a week, 4 days a week. I had 7 groups and a full caseload when I finally made the decision to leave the
Wow.
hospital. And that was awesome for like 2 years until I got to the point where I had so many referrals, I didn't know what to do with them all and didn't have the time or space for them. But I also didn't want to send them to the general practitioner down the street because the work I was doing and the training I had in DBT was really important to me that other teenagers get that quality of care. So I decided to build a small team and train them so that we could do this work together. And then a small team of 4 is now a small team of almost 20 and 2 locations. And it just grew
Wow.
really fast because I mean, good for business, but bad for the world, maybe. There's so many teens that are struggling
Yeah.
that I'm just so honored that we have a team that can support that work.
Now, where is creative healing?
We have 2 locations. One is in Flowertown, it's Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, and one is in Wayne, which is on the main line in
In
Pennsylvania.
Wayne.
And
I
so,
know Wayne.
yeah, oh, you do?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and are you doing any work online or is it all
Oh,
location
yeah.
based? You are. Okay.
Oh, yeah. I mean, is anyone not doing work online now with
Yeah.
post-pandemic? Maybe
Yeah.
they aren't,
Well,
but
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
we're
What I meant
definitely.
is it just restricted to Pennsylvania, your online
Oh,
work?
I see. Yeah, so we can see clients in Pennsylvania and Florida right now.
Okay. Okay. Um, really cool. So I want to, sorry, jumping around. I want to go back to uh, the question I asked about what therapists maybe don't know or need to know in terms of working with kids, and you talked about kind of the complexity and so forth. What are some other things?
Mhm. I think I hit on some of it when I was saying that you need to be able to work with the parent. And so I think that having the skills to address parent concerns or even the confidence to say, you know what, I think this is coming from your own childhood or your own stuff and you need your own therapy. So really feeling comfortable and confident addressing the parent side of things. And I think one thing that's been really instrumental for me and a lot of people on my team is having team support because it's so
Mhm.
easy to get pulled into judgments or frustration or hopelessness when you're working with really high risk teens and also sometimes many times parents who want them to get better quickly and they're just
Right.
not going to get better quickly. And so it's tricky to not get polarized somewhere in there, so having other therapists to be able to debrief with and to say like, you know what, I think that might be judgmental, or I think we might need to take a step back and look at this from a different perspective, I think is so important. I don't know how I could do this work without a team at this point.
Yeah, good point. So as we kind of wind down here, in terms of the groups you did, are you still doing groups now?
My team does groups. So we have about
Okay.
15 groups for different reasons at our center.
Okay.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, what are some of the qualities that you think are effective or were effective in the groups that you ran? Why did they resonate so much with the kids?
I would say, I mean, a lot of our groups are DBT groups, and I would say in general, our groups really work because we gear them towards teenagers. So they are interactive. We provide them space where they can share, but also structured within that curriculum. So it's not just glory stories or people learning
Right.
new
Right.
information. And we do creative activities. We'll take them outside. We do it like gamified or interactive. And it's so they're learning skills, but they're learning them through interaction, through activity, through situations that are relevant to them. And I think that that makes all the difference. It's not just reading from a book or using a whiteboard to teach a skill. We're teaching it through the lens of how they prefer to learn, or they get excited to come to group and tell parents they had a good time at group, which is a cool thing to hear considering they're learning how to regulate their emotions in that process.
Hmm. Um, so for the listeners out there, who most of whom are in the mental health field, if they want to, after hearing you, they're like, okay, I want to start working with kids. I want to start working with teens. What would you say
Mhm.
would be a first step?
I would say if you want to start working with kids or you want to start working with teens, two things that helped me a lot. I trained as a play therapist, and I don't think that everybody needs to do that, but I think understanding the language of children if you're going to work with children is really important. So if you're working with 10 and under, definitely check out some play therapy trainings. And for me, the two things that I still use and I learned back in the day were expressive arts. So I trained under a play therapist and I learned creative modalities and expressive arts and DBT. And that just, there's so many concrete skills that we can pull in that are practical and applicable in working with the teen population. They're not gonna, I'm gonna generalize now, but for the most part, they're not gonna do psychodynamic work. They're not gonna do
Hmm.
depth work because they haven't had enough of a life to do that deep work, but also
Hmm.
most of them don't want to. And I think
Hmm.
if you go into working with teenagers thinking you're going to have every perfect 16-year-old insight oriented teenager who wants to be in therapy, you're going to be disappointed. I have to
Right.
do that in my interview process with new therapists. That's everyone's perfect client, but that's not the majority of clients that
Hmm.
we see. So learning how to teach skills, learning some kind of motivational interviewing or some kind of increasing motivation strategy for clients that may not fully be self-motivated to be in treatment, and managing your expectations are really important. But the biggest thing is you have to love it. Like
Right.
if you don't love working with teenagers, please don't work with teenagers because you have to
Right.
love it to really do
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Awesome. Uh, Katie, love talking to you. You're so inspiring, and obviously you love the work you're doing. Love to have you
I do.
back at a later time. It's awesome to talk to you. What's the best way for people to learn more about what you're doing and get in touch with you?
a couple ways. If you're in the Philadelphia area, creativehealingphilly.com is my practice website. And any interest in the kind of work that I do with parents and teens, you'ronfireitsfine.com is where you can find information about my book and membership and things like that.
You'ronfire.com.
You're on fire, it's fine.
You'ronfireitsfine.com. Okay, we'll have that linked up here, the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Katie, awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, we'll be in touch. Take care.